After 4 pregnancies that never reached the morning, I learned to measure time by the spaces they left behind. The empty bassinet at the corner of our bedroom, the stack of folded onesies I could not bring myself to wear, the calendar pages torn off in silence. We tried for years, appointments, blood work, quiet promises whispered into pillows. Each time hope began to grow, it would be taken with the morning light. I kept thinking the ache would dull, that sorrow would become a softer thing. It did not. It stayed raw, like a stone in the shoe you forget, until it rubs and bleeds. The first loss came early one winter morning. I remember the hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and coffee, and my hands were the only warm thing in the room. He'd taken my hand and said something small and ordinary. "Do you want more coffee?" Because that felt less breakable than anything about to be said. The doctor used soft words, words that meant not viable and we're sorry. And later, when we sat in the car with the engine idling, the radio played an old hymn we couldn't sing. We drove home as if returning to a house that had always been half empty. We learned the ritual of grief, dark rooms, the shaking of limbs, the way the world tried to rush us through the things that required time. We carried jars of grief like glass vessels, each with a label we could not read. The second loss came in spring. I had convinced myself by then that the season was kinder to pregnant women, that green leaves might breathe blessing into us. Instead, I woke to rain and the sound of the washing machine swallowing our towels. I sat on the cold tile and felt the punishing slowness of my own heart. My husband Aaron sat beside me and let me cry until his throat rasped with the same kind of hurt. He said nothing about blame. He said, "We will keep loving," and the sentence was both map and burden. The third time, they sent us home with strict instructions and a warmth that tasted like pity. We tried a procedure at the specialist, small hopeful steps that felt both clinical and intimate. There was a stack of pamphlets that explained possibilities, and a nurse who tried to make us laugh. We laughed in the wrong places, in the parking lot, the way people sometimes laugh to keep from falling apart. The fourth loss felt like a closing of a book that hadn't been written. It came after a season of prayers that hummed in the background of our days, interspersed with short, sharp moments of rage that surprised me. I had always imagined my faith would be a shield. Instead, it became a landscape in which I was learning to walk, careful not to collapse. We tried everything we thought we could. We tried silence. We tried doctors. We tried conversations with clergy, with friends whose stories of childbearing were bright and tidy.
We tried to be grateful for each other, for the tiny mercies, a neighbor's casserole, a friend's text at 3 a.m. that said, "I'm thinking of you," an older woman from our church who pressed her thumb into the back of my hand and stayed there like an anchor. None of it erased the missing beat. There were ordinary markers of loss. I remember folding the bassinet sheet and tucking it into the closet. I remember standing at the nursery window, watching frost bead on the glass like a string of tears I couldn't wipe away. We tried to speak of future children, as if naming them aloud might herald their arrival. "Maybe we'll pick a name this weekend," we'd say, and then the sentence would stop, because the possibility itself felt like betrayal. People said well-meaning things. "Everything happens for a reason. Just give it time. You're so strong." Those words were not untrue, but they sat oddly in my mouth. Strength is not only heroic, it is also exhausted. I learned to accept help with the humility of someone whose hands would not be enough. After the fourth time, there was a long, quiet season in which it felt like God had stepped back so I could see the landscape more clearly. I used wilderness as a metaphor at first, the barren plain stretching out before me. Later, I would find that winter and wilderness have their own wild work. Roots thicken in those places, and something below the surface is still very much alive. We did not know the shape of what would come next, but we had to do something other than wait. Waiting is its own vocation, but it cannot be the whole life. Adoption was not an afterthought. It was not, as some had suggested, a consolation prize. It was a decision born of love and of action. I remember sitting at our kitchen table with a sheaf of papers, the afternoon light turning the edges golden. I folded my hands around a pen and felt both terror and relief. There was an urgency to it, a desire to overflow our home with a child's laugh, to stop living in the constant arithmetic of loss. We signed the forms with hands that trembled, felt the weight of signatures as if they were promises to keep. From the first meeting, adoption felt like stepping into a river colder than we expected, shocking and awake. The days of the process were punctuated by small, intimate scenes that made a new kind of family feel possible and terrifying at once. We sat in the social worker's office while she explained matching and timelines, her voice efficient and kind. We watched home study inspectors walk through our house, open cabinets, measure rooms,
ask questions we had not imagined, and I felt exposed and seen in a way that was both healing and humiliated. The paperwork was endless and sacred. Every reference letter felt like someone stepping into our story and saying we were worthy of belonging.
When the call came that a match had been identified, I remember the morning light slanting through the blinds, as if the world had turned something brighter on. Our agency counselor's voice was steady. "There's a child available who is a good match." The word available felt strange, but the counselor's tenderness softened it. We were not taking a thing. We were stepping into a life. We traveled that day with our hearts leaning forward like travelers before a threshold. I clutched a small canvas bag in my lap that held a knitted blanket someone from our church had made. The scent of it, wool and lemon soap, followed me into the meeting room and stayed attached to my hands for days. The first time I held our child, a tiny, indignant, sleeping being who smelled like milk and detergent and the inside of a dryer, I was undone. There is a particular hush when someone places a small life into your arms for the first time, a rearrangement of the soul. I remember the weight of the breath warm against my wrist, the surprising kick of tiny toes, as if they already had opinions about the world. My husband watched me with a softness that said everything we'd been through together had finally led to this small miracle of domesticity. We laughed then, a short, raw sound, and we cried. There was no replacing of past losses, there was an expansion. The first night home was the kind of chaos that writes itself into memory. A car ride with a baby monitor on my lap, a cereal bowl spilled on the passenger floor, the way the city looked like a watercolor at dusk. We set up the nursery by lamplight, a mobile with small stars overhead, a soft rug that swallowed footsteps. I put the knitted blanket over the tiny body and lay awake for hours listening to a new kind of breathing. Not the absence of breath, but the persistence of it. Sleep was an odd, stolen thing. In the quiet, I would sometimes find myself speaking into the darkness in a language older than hope. "Lord, keep this one." And the prayer felt less like a command and more like a plea to the world to be gentle. Adoption is often pictured as immediate joy, but the truth is more complicated. Joy came in great, unexpected surges, belly laughs during bath time, the way a small hand wraps itself around a finger, the first clumsy attempt at walking. But the grief we carried did not evaporate. It became part of the household, a shadow at certain edges, a history that we honored. On the colder evenings, when the house hummed with the heater and the baby slept against my chest, I would allow myself to remember the children we'd lost. I would name them in the silence and let tears fall into the blanket. Naming made them human in a way bureaucracy never could. Community grew around us like helpful vines. Our church rallied not in a flashy spectacle, but in steady, practical love. Meals left at the door, offers to babysit, text threads that read like warm blankets.
A neighbor knocked on our door with a pie. A woman from the Bible study brought new diapers and an old, well-loved copy of Stories for Children. Our pastor visited with a small, effusive prayer, and then quietly sat and fed the baby while we ate like people who had been given more time. These acts were not dramatic, but they were as necessary as anything that happened in the doctor's office. Adoption had reconfigured our family, and it also reconfigured how others saw us. Gawky kindness replaced the awkward pity that had come with loss. There were moments of tremendous tenderness and moments of clumsy adjustment. I fumbled with stroller clasps, learned the precise way this small person liked to be swaddled. I discovered that I could do things I had feared I could not. I also discovered that certain nights the grief returned like a phantom limb, the memory of what wasn't there, made present by a lullaby or the smell of a certain baby shampoo. Aaron and I learned new ways of speaking about our past losses, less in the language of defeat and more in the language of witness. We tried, he would say. We lost. And then, softer, we loved. Those three simple verbs became a condensation of our story: effort, sorrow, devotion. We allowed ourselves to feel elation and guilt simultaneously, to laugh and to honor. It was in those months that I began to regard the idea of blessing in a different light. Blessing is not always a sudden falling of good fortune. Sometimes it is slow and domestic, built from sleepless nights and casseroles and the steady drip of neighborly goodwill. We learned to steward what we had been given with a fierceness that was almost reverential. We changed diapers,
attended well-child appointments, went to support groups for new adoptive parents, where other people shared stories of legal labyrinths and bonding difficulties, and also of midnight epiphanies when a child finally smiled without prompting. The stories helped us feel less like anomalies and more like people who had joined an old, complicated tradition. There were hard conversations with friends and family who viewed adoption through different lenses. Some couldn't reconcile the fact that we had chosen adoption after losses. They asked why we had not continued treatments, why we had chosen a child that came without a medical history we fully knew. We answered as best we could. Adoption is not a plan B. It is for us an act of saying yes to human life and to the invitation to mother. We explained that adopting did not cancel the grief. It simply invited another kind of love into our home. People listened or they didn't, and that was part of the terrain we had to walk. We learned to accept that our story might not be neat. At night, when the house breathed and the baby slept with the rhythm of someone newly adapted to our life, I would find myself in strange conversations with God. They weren't polished prayers, but murmured honest things.
"If you are here," I would whisper, "show me how to be grateful without erasing what we've lost." Sometimes I would say thank you, and the words lodged in my chest like a warm seed. Other times, I said nothing at all, and that silence felt like an altar. One evening, months after the adoption was finalized, and our child's laughter had become part of the fabric of our days, Aaron came home with slow steps and an expression I didn't immediately recognize. He held our child on his hip and rubbed the back in a practiced, tender motion. "We should mark this," he said, and I pulled him toward the table because he had that look that meant he wanted to share the weight of something. We brewed tea and sat with the baby between us, who was fussing at the rim of sleep. "What are you thinking?" I asked. He set the mug down and exhaled. "I was thinking about how fragile good things feel," he said, "and how all the little people who helped get us here deserve to know." He took out his phone and started a list, names of people to send notes to, a plan for a small gathering to thank those who had helped. We organized a modest celebration, not ostentation, just a meal with a few friends and family. We wanted to honor the road that led us to parenthood without turning it into a spectacle. People arrived with flowers and casseroles and stories. They sat on our couch and watched our child explore a cardboard box with the solemnness of a tiny archaeologist. We listened to people speak about resilience and grace in ways that made us uncomfortable, because nothing about our journey had been easy. A friend offered a prayer that was short and not slick. "God, keep this home lively and safe," she said. "Let us not forget those whose arms are empty tonight." The prayer landed like a benediction. In public, our faces began to carry a new shape. Strangers would smile at us with the soft approval of someone acknowledging a family in formation. At the grocery store, a woman would ask if our child was ours, and then, when we said yes and added that the baby was adopted, she'd offer her own small tribute, a story of a niece or an uncle. These ordinary encounters knitted us into a broader human fabric and humbled us with reminders that family looks different in different hands. As seasons changed, so did our home. Where once the nursery had been a place haunted by unrealized futures, it became the site of tiny triumphs, first steps against a coffee table, finger paints on the kitchen floor, songs with made-up lyrics. I sat in the evenings with the fading light and tried to hold all of it, the memory of 4 losses, the fierce tenderness of this adopted child, the quiet work of rebuilding. I started to say, with more frequency than I had allowed before, "We are so grateful." Saying it did not erase sorrow. It simply allowed it to sit alongside gratitude, like 2 old friends who had learned to tolerate one another. There was a church group for adoptive families that met monthly, and going to those gatherings felt like returning to a room where other people understood the particular knot of joy and grief we carried. People spoke about attachment challenges and legal heartbreaks, about how celebrating a family can sometimes feel like an accusation to someone still grieving. We listened and offered what support we could. We learned practical things too, how to keep records, how to advocate for our child's needs, how to talk about origins with honesty and tenderness. We discovered that adoption required the same fierce, day-by-day tending as any parenting journey. Then there were quieter, interior shifts. My body, which had been the site of so much trying and loss, began to feel less like an enemy and more like a companion. I stopped measuring its worth by what it had not produced, and more by what it could hold: a community, a child, grief, and gratitude. I started to go to the park again, not because I had recovered, but because people had asked me to be present, and I wanted to be present. It was a small discipline. Show up, even when your hands tremble. One morning in late summer, our child's laughter poured through the house like a bright stitch. I stood at the sink washing dishes, the light making the water look like quicksilver, and felt an unfamiliar lightness at the edge of my chest. Love had made our home busy and beautiful, but it had also, in some small way, reset the cadence of anticipation in me. I didn't expect anything else. I had stopped keeping the calendar afraid. The dates that once felt like the ticking of a bomb now read like ordinary footnotes. There is a particular innocence to the days after adoption, when the world seems rearranged into possibility. We had practiced gratitude like a prayer, and sometimes it truly felt like one. Yet grief remained present, like a room in our mental house that we visited with great respect. It was there when I found a tiny onesie with a faint stain, and sat on the floor rocking it as if company. It was there when the pediatrician asked about family history, and I answered with a truthful economy. We have children we lost, and a child we adopted. People would sometimes look away then, unsure of which part of that sentence to hold, and I learned to hold it all for them. I could have rested there, in the new rhythm of family and church and ordinary marvels, letting life move forward with a softened grief. But life, as it tends to do, has a way of delivering the unexpected. There is a hush before certain kinds of news, a stillness that is different than healing silence. For me, that hush came as a kind of unremarkable cause, a missed period, and a thought so small it could be ignored. I noticed the pause because I had been trained to notice absences. I bought a cheap test at the corner store more for ritual than belief. The packaging crinkled under my fingers. The scent of the plastic tin was oddly synthetic and familiar. I went to the bathroom and held my breath in a habit born of years of waiting. When the line appeared, thin and unassuming, my first response was disbelief so thorough it felt like a physical shock. I laughed, a small, disbelieving sound, and then I cried. The tears were not full of undiluted joy. They were layered. There was wonder, yes, and a cautious hope that still had scars. There was a memory of towels left in the washing machine to muster the courage to show this to Aaron, who was kneading dough in the kitchen like he always did when life seemed too heavy for words. I showed him the test, that small rectangle that felt like a dare. He read it and said, "Are you sure?" in the way people ask because they hope for reassurance. We bought another test because the world had taught us to verify. The second test matched the first. We sat at the table, our child asleep in a high chair nearby, and our hands found each other's again. The house hummed with the ordinary, an air conditioner, the soft breathing of our child, the tick of a clock, and it felt miraculous, because miracles sometimes dress in common things. We did not shout it from the rooftops. We walked slowly into the news as if stepping into cold water. I called my sister first, and then my mother. Aaron called his father, and then our pastor. We told them in small segments, testing the way the news settled in their throats. The reactions were what you'd expect: tears, laughter, a tapping of hands against cheeks. Our pastor said only, "We'll pray," and I was grateful for the simplicity of it. But the past had taught us caution. Hope, after so many losses, had to be handled like glass. We made an appointment with our doctor because we wanted more than a line on a strip. We wanted to be seen, to have someone who understood the delicate arithmetic of our lives validate what we were experiencing. The doctor was careful and warm, a person whose hands seemed to know how to hold stories without breaking them. "We'll take this one step at a time," she said, which felt like a map I could follow. That is where I must pause, because even the smallest confession of hope in such a long story can feel like opening a door whose other side we have not yet seen. There is a waiting that comes now, but it is not the same as before. It is inhabited by an adopted child at my side, and the memory of 4 losses stitched into my ribs. It is tender and trembling, and in a way I am just beginning to understand, wide with possibility. There are appointments to be made, questions to be answered, anxious and prayerful conversations to come. There is this shape of a future forming like a silhouette against morning light, and we are learning to look without scandal or fear, simply with the steady curiosity of people who have known both absence and abundance.
The doctor's office smelled of lemon hand soap and the faint metallic tang that always seems to clinics. I remember the light being bright enough to feel like a question. We sat on opposite sides of the small chair, our hands finding each other without thinking. Our child was at a table nearby with crayons, humming a tune that had no words. The nurse took my blood pressure like she was measuring me for something big, and the doctor came in with a soft smile that felt practiced but kind. "We'll do an ultrasound," she said, and the words sounded ordinary, which made my stomach flip in an extraordinary way. The technician dimmed the lights and covered the screen as if protecting us from a sudden glare of possibility. There's a particular hush in an ultrasound room that feels irreverent, like stepping into a chapel where the sermon is quiet and the music is a machine's steady pulse. At first, we saw one small flicker on the screen, a heartbeat like a bright little metronome. Relief uncoiled in me so quietly it could have been missed. I exhaled without realizing it. My shoulders dropped for the first time in months. The technician moved the probe slowly, watching the screen with a concentration that made the room thinner, less like a clinic and more like an aperture into some private geography. Her face, which had been calm and professional, shifted into a look I recognized from other parts of my life, someone who has just seen something she did not expect. "There's more than one," she said, not a question, but a fact that landed like a stone in water and made every surface ripple. The voice I had been holding loosened, and I laughed in a way that contained disbelief and a kind of flung-open joy. I remember the sound of the laughter like a small bell. Aaron squeezed my hand until the knuckles went white. He leaned in, and though he tried to keep his bearing, his mouth trembled as he formed a smile that was both terrified and elated. "How many?" I asked, my voice small in the acoustic way that sometimes happens when the world rearranges itself. The technician didn't answer right away. She moved the wand, and the screen showed another flicker, then another, and another. The first flicker became 4 little joyful staccatos, each one a miniature declaration. For a moment time condensed, years of appointments and loss and the gentle, secret work of hope, all stacked into a single thin rectangle of light. "There are 4, the doctor said when she came back in, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone handling a treasure and a responsibility at once. "Quadruplets." It felt like the air had been removed and then slowly pumped back in. There was a sound that was equal parts a laugh and a sob. My body did something I had not expected. I folded forward and then straightened like someone remembering how to stand. I could see Aaron in profile, and the expression on his face was a mixture of reverence and fear.
He whispered, 4, as if testing the word to see if it would hold. My first response was to pray without words. A breath that contained 1,000 thank yous and 1,000 pleas rose up in me. "Lord," I thought, not out loud at first, then aloud because the air seemed to need it. "Lord, this is more than I imagined. Help us steward this life." The prayer was not a bargaining chip. It was a small offering from someone who had learned the sacredness of asking simply and honestly. There are moments when you think you might be frozen, when the world seems to tilt and your limbs feel new and clumsy. I sat back and the room resumed its sensible proportions. The technician printed a few images, 4 ghostly grainy forms that would later hang in our kitchen like a map of what was to come. The doctor spoke calmly about next steps, more monitoring, referrals to specialists, to a maternal fetal medicine team who could walk with us through the pregnancy. Her tone was steady and professional. It grounded us even as the news had loosened the ground under our feet. We left the clinic with a small envelope of photos and our adopted child asleep against Aaron's chest. The city breathed around us like an exhale. On the way home, we did what people do when confronted with the miraculous and the frightening. We talked in fragments and then in silence. We sat at the kitchen table with the envelope open between us, the ultrasound images catching the light as if they were small windows. "How will we do this?" Aaron asked finally, the question bursting the same way all practical questions do when confronted with wonder. "We will do what we always do," I answered. "We will ask for help, we will plan, we will keep showing up." Saying it aloud made it sound both less naive and less impossible. We called our caster. We told a handful of trusted friends and family, people who had held us through the losses and had learned to sit with our complicated, layered grief. Their responses were immediate and tender. Tears, laughter, practical offers. "We'll make meals. We can pick up your child from preschool. Tell us how to help." The church rallied not with spectacle but with steadiness. Texts, prayer chains, a potluck arranged for the following weekend. The response was a reminder we needed. Community is not merely a comfort. It is a practical scaffolding. Yet alongside the support, there were honest, sharp questions that needed answers.
and the doctor delivered them without sugarcoating. Multiple babies often mean more appointments, more scans, and a higher level of vigilance. There could be bed rest or hospital monitoring at later stages. We could not promise outcomes. There were medical realities to keep in view even as we trusted. I clung to that duality, to let faith and fear both have a seat at the table, to name the human worries without letting them be the only story. We began to map a new version of life on top of the life we already had.
There were conversations about logistics that felt almost comical in their scale. 4 cribs, 4 car seats, furniture rearranged, the question of how to sleep when your home is suddenly the medical epicenter of a family of 6+. We consulted other families who had multiples, and they were generous with experience, without pretending it was easy. They told us about community laundromats, about the rituals that made feeding loops feel survivable, about the way a village shows up and sometimes stays around like a second family. Financial worry arrived like a guest we had expected but not wanted. Health insurance, time off work, childcare, each of these felt like a riddle that required patience more than genius. We made spreadsheets in the evenings, sitting at the table while our adopted child drew concentric circles and the kettle hissed. Friends brought homemade lasagnas and diaper donations, and people from church set up a meal train. Practical help arrived with an assurance that this was not just our burden to carry. There was redemption in receiving, even as I felt pangs of pride and indignity. Asking for help is a strange humility. It asks you to admit your limits without shame. Appointments multiplied, and the rhythm of the pregnancy took on a new cadence. Frequent ultrasounds, consultations, a team of doctors who spoke in cautious, respectful language. Each visit was a mixture of jubilation and sobered attention. At one appointment, the nurse took our adopted child's hand and drew pictures on a sticker sheet to keep them occupied while we were in the consult. The small things, crayons, a friendly smile, a neighbor's casserole, were undergirding the large things we could not fix with our own hands. At night, I often lay awake thinking about the children we had lost, their names I had given in private, their faces I had imagined. I began to speak their names more often, not in sorrow, but in witness, allowing the fact of their brief existence to be part of the story we were now carrying. The adoption had already taught me how to hold contradiction, to allow grief and gladness to occupy the same room. Now that practice would need to expand. I started saying aloud the 3 words Aaron had once spoken in the more tender times. We tried, we lost, we loved. Each phrase held its own gravity. There were smaller, tender scenes that carried the weight of those months. I remember a rainy afternoon when our adopted child fell asleep in my lap on the couch, their head heavy with sleep and trust. Aaron was at the counter, sketching a plan for rearranging the nursery. We sipped tea and read the ultrasound photos again, as if the pictures might give us instruction. The house felt like a cocoon, not because everything was settled, but because there was a concentration of care inside its walls that felt holy. And then there was fear. It arrived uninvited, and sometimes stayed for days. I would wake with my heart pounding, imagining the worst-case scenarios medical teams sometimes mention in clinical tones. When the fear crowded my chest, I would step outside and look at the trees in our yard, the ones that had stood through winters and still held green in the spring. The metaphors I had used during barren seasons returned to me as lifelines. Winter is not absence. It is a season in which roots thicken. I forced myself to repeat those images until they were steadier than the fear. I allowed myself to be honest with God. If this is heavy, then make our arms strong to carry it, I whispered during one sleepless night. The prayer was not a transaction. It was a request offered from the marrow. Our child, the one we had adopted, watched all of this with the unself-conscious curiosity of a small person who had already mastered the country known as resilience. They asked, in their simple way, if there would be many babies and if they would have to share toys. We tried, as gently as we could, to translate complexity into language a small person could hold. We made plans but left room for improvisation. Parenting, after all, is less about controlling variables and more about being present enough to respond. The church became a primary witness to our story. There were prayer meetings where people prayed not for a miracle in the sense of a demand, but for steady hands, for wisdom for our doctors, for grace for our family. People brought casseroles and offered to sew cloth organizers and volunteered to drive to appointments.
A group from our small community made a schedule to check in with us twice a week, and it became a backbone. It is hard to overstate how crucial that ordinary, repeated support can be. We were learning that love is often practical: casseroles, rides, babysitting for the child who would remain a constant in the center of the storm. There were moments of private reckoning with the theological questions that lingered like smoke after a fire. Why had we lost before? Why now? Should we have done something differently? I read and prayed and walked with people who asked better questions than they had answers. There is a humility in living with unanswered questions. We held on to an honesty that faith is not a tidy algorithm that predicts outcomes. It is a kind of companionship with a God who dwells in the messy middle of things. At 20 weeks, a marker that had once felt like an impossible far shore, we sat in another ultrasound room with friends from church who had come as a chosen backup family in case we needed company. The technician moved the probe and said, "I've got one, then, and another," and then she paused in that same way as before. We laughed like we were inhaling air for the first time. The image on the screen was clearer: 4 little profiles, 4 fast-beating hearts.
Later, in the car, we spoke about names and the logistics of naps, and the absurd possibility that any given day would be both chaotic and profoundly ordinary. We began to prepare the house. There was a steady stream of second-hand items from friends who had raised multiples: flannel sheets and a play yard that unfolded like a small tent, 4 little outfits in a row, washed and folded. We painted the nursery a soft neutral color, so the room could be a shared space rather than a series of segregated corners. Aaron built a shelf that could hold tiny shoes in perfect alignment. The adopted child's small hand would sometimes rest on the new changing table, as if blessing it with curiosity. Sometimes they would chat to the belly, pressing their forehead to it like a child talking to a sleeping friend. We also had to consider the unknowns. There were honest conversations about insurance and parental leave and possible work adjustments. We consulted an accountant who helped us sketch a plan without promising comfort. The church's outreach coordinator helped us find local resources for families with multiples, and a friend in a nearby town connected us to a peer group that had navigated similar terrain. All of these were not magic solutions, but they were points of connection in a network that would help hold us. Practical help arrived not as a rescue, but as comradeship. As the pregnancy progressed, the physical burden became a daily reality. I learned new ways to stand and to sit. I asked for help with groceries and with lifting small things. My body, which had once felt like a battleground, now felt like a conduit for the lives growing inside. There was a sacredness to simply moving, to going to appointments, to taking in breath. I began keeping a small notebook where I wrote small letters to the children. Not letters about doctrine, but about ordinary life, the way the light in our kitchen slanted in the morning, the taste of sugar on Aaron's lips when he kissed me, the sound our adopted child made when they slept. I told them about the trees in the yard and about the friend who made their blanket. It felt like a way of giving them a preface to the story they were about to inherit. There were hard nights too: physical discomfort, intrusive worries, the sense of being watched by a curiosity that alternated between joyful and invasive. People asked questions that I sometimes couldn't answer. I learned to set boundaries kindly and to be honest about fatigue. I needed rest and was learning to ask for it. The church's meal train continued, neighbors offered to drive to appointments, and friends took our adopted child for a sleepover so Aaron and I could nap on a Sunday afternoon. Those afternoons became small sanctuaries. As we neared the 3rd trimester, the medical team asked more pointed questions and suggested more frequent monitoring. There were discussions of delivery plans and of a hospital that specialized in high-risk births.
I tried to absorb this practical talk without letting it become the only narrative. I held on to an internal image of 4 small hands intertwined, of a house that would be noisy and full, and, in time, ordinary. There were also tender moments of theology that I had not expected to find. In a quiet reflection one evening, I was reading a psalm that spoke of God being near to the brokenhearted, and I felt relief, not because it answered every question, but because it named the reality of human sorrow and divine proximity. It was a theological framing rather than a formula. I began to say aloud in the kitchen, "We do not know all the whys. We will nevertheless choose love." The sentence became a kind of liturgy, repeated in small ways, before meals, in the car, in the hospital waiting room. The adopted child, who was now 3, assumed a role that surprised us both. They became a helper in ways both practical and emotional. They pressed soft kisses to my belly and asked if the babies would be hungry like they were. They colored cards for the babies and helped fold tiny socks. Watching them prepared me for a family that would be woven from both biological and adoptive threats. I began to envision the family photograph, a group that testified to loss and to an extravagant, sometimes bewildering generosity of life. When the day of delivery finally arrived,
and here I step lightly because every birth is a private sacredness. The hospital room hummed with coordinated activity. We had decided on a team, a plan that honored both medical guidance and our deep desire for a birth that could be tender even under clinical lights. Aaron held my hand in the delivery suite, fingers interlaced, the same hand that had once held me through a winter of grief. The adopted child's small hand was pressed into the palm of a friend who had agreed to bring them to the hospital when the time came. The labor was long, and not without its fears. There were moments when I felt I had nothing left to give, and others when a fierce well of determination rose up. In the in-between spaces, I would whisper to God, not because I expected a particular outcome, but because words helped me stay human. If these are the children you've given us, I would say, make us faithful stewards of their lives. When the babies were born, 4 tiny bodies, 4 whales that carved the air, there was a rupture and a reknitting. The nurses wrapped them in soft blankets and placed them on my chest, little warm miracles that smelled like vernix and new milk. I saw Aaron's face as if for the first time, the man who had journeyed with me through so much, and everything rearranged itself yet again. The adopted child's small face, watching from the edge of the room with a held breath, was the most honest portrait of wonder and love. We did not emerge from the delivery as people who had solved the problem of suffering.
Loss remained part of the air we breathed. It did not vanish because of a new arrangement of family, but there was an expansion, a filling, that did not erase the empty spaces, but made room for more stories. People we had not expected joined in the care and the astonishment. Nurses who had years of experience with multiples, who offered advice not as commands, but as lifelines. Friends who arrived with casseroles and laughter. Church members who brought small quilts and cards. The weeks that followed were pure apprenticeship. There were feeding schedules that felt like rocket science, diaper changes that came in dizzying cycles, and nights where I existed in a kind of dream state, made of small sounds and the glow of a nightlight. Our home was full of 4 tiny birthdays, and our adopted child learned the language of generosity in ways that made us weep. A neighbor brought over an old bassinet and a stack of board books, and the church found times to come and sit with durable, ordinary presents. Parenting multiples was a daily act of improvisation and humility. I won't pretend the early days were poetic. They were raw and overwhelmingly practical. There were times I cried not from sorrow, but from the sheer weight of love and responsibility. There were fractures in patience and sharp nights when the only thing we could do was rotate turning and feedings and wash and fold. We learned to accept help without feeling diminished. We learned to ask or sleep as if it were a sacrament. In those months, I found myself returning to the work of naming. Not the naming of each child in a list, but the naming of experiences, the act of putting language to things so they were not swallowed by silence. I named fear, I named gratitude, I named grief with tenderness. I taught our adopted child that it's okay to have complicated feelings, that you can love widely and still have rooms of sorrow in your heart. We made space at the table for contradictory emotions and modeled how to hold them with gentleness. Theologically, this season reoriented my understanding of blessing. Blessings are not neat boxes labeled receipt. They are messy rooms filled with light and shadows. The birth of 4 children did not cancel the memory of the 4 we had lost. Instead, it layered the story. I began to see blessing as a stewardship rather than a simple reward. We were entrusted with lives that would need tending and protection, and above all, a community to help carry the load. Along the way, we encountered people who interpreted our story as a neat moral illustration. Pray and the heavens will be kind. I learned to protect the nuance of my testimony. I never wanted to imply a formula where none exists. There are many who pray and do not receive the outcomes they desire. There are families who grieve without a visible resolution. My testimony is not meant to be a prescription.
It is an honesty about what happened to my family, and an invitation to witness to a God who moves in ways both mysterious and merciful. People asked whether we felt guilt, survivor's guilt, now complicated by a plurality of existence. Sometimes there were pangs, a whispering thought, why us? Why this arrangement? But grief and gratitude sat together. I learned to allow space for the one without diminishing the other. We found ways to recognize the missing, without allowing it to become a refinery of sorrow. We made room on our mantle for small reminders, a candle for remembering, a framed ultrasound for celebrating, photographs that held both shadow and light. Our church became the midwife of our community life. Members took turns bringing coffee, offering rides, and watching our adopted child when the nights pooled too deep into the next day. People came who had known loss and who also had tenderness for the gifts we had received. Their presence did not fix everything, but it was an honest, steadying force. As the babies grew, extraordinary things happened in ordinary ways. The adopted child learned to be, in their own small, sometimes fierce fashion, a champion of each sibling. They comforted with the tenderness of someone who had been loved into existence in a new home. Our days were overturned by little feet and laughter, and yes, the occasional squabble. There were diaper blowouts at the worst possible moments, and sweet triumphs like the first simultaneous nap, which felt like a tiny, improbable miracle on its own. There were larger lessons, too. We learned how to accept limits, of body, of energy, of time, and to ask for help with humility. We learned the art of delegation. Friends took turns bringing dinner. Neighbors took the recycling out. A retired woman from our church came once a week to tell stories and fold tiny clothes, and she stayed long enough to become family. That rhythm of shared labor taught us that blessing often comes as a constellation of small earthly acts. And then, years later, in quiet moments, when someone asked us about our family, I would sometimes think about the strange geometry of our life, how losses had hollowed us out and made room for other kinds of filling, how adoption had been an act of saying yes to a life already in the wings, how a small positive test had unlatched a chain of events we could not have predicted. I never built a theology around the sequence. I built instead a practice of gratitude and of critical tenderness. I wanted to honor both the ones who were here and the ones we had carried only in memory. If there is a single thing I might pass on to someone walking through the wilderness of infertility or of loss, it is this: allow yourself the full spectrum of feeling. Grief is not the opposite of gratitude. Love is not a finite commodity that, when invested in one child, is no longer available to another.
There is an elastic quality to the heart that I had not expected, a way in which it can hold multiple truths at once. I will say, too, that adoption changed how we thought of family. It taught us that biology is not the only language of belonging. The child who came to us by adoption taught us things births sometimes do not, about trust, about the slow work of attachment, about the way a child's laughter rewires a home. They were not a consolation. They were a full person with a story that intersected with ours and enriched it. And so we carried forward, not with a triumphant banner, but with the slow, ordinary work of living into the gifts and the losses we had been given. We tended the babies with a tenderness that felt like a sacrament, and we honored the four we had grieved by naming them and by refusing to let their memory be flattened. My prayer for anyone who has walked the path of loss or who is considering adoption is simple. May you be held. May you find companions who understand that joy can be loud and soft at the same time, that a household can be full and also bear the weight of absence. If this story touches you in some way, whether you are in the valley of waiting, in the complicated brightness of adoption, or in the dizzying first days of parenting, know that you are not alone. If you are walking through loss or adoption, drop a heart below. I read every comment, and I mean it when I say we hold you in prayer. Finally, I want to leave you with a small blessing. Lord, for the ways you fret the edges of our brokenness into something like beauty, thank you. For the fierce, ordinary people who showed up at our door and in our hospital rooms, thank you. Teach us how to steward what we have been given with humility and courage. Let grief and joy find each other without erasing one another. Help us to be a community that feeds, that bears, that loves with practical hands and open hearts. If this testimony resonated with you, please subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear that blessings can arrive in unexpected shapes and that families grow in many kinds of light. If you want resources about adoption or support for families who've experienced pregnancy loss, check the description for reputable organizations and local groups that helped our family. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for holding space for stories that are messy, tender, and real.